By February 19, 1943, the waters around Guadalcanal contained more sunken warships than any other place on Earth. 49 ships lay on the ocean floor. 2 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 24 Japanese transports filled with the bodies of men who never made it to shore. The Americans called it Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of steel stretching across 20 miles of ocean. But 6 months earlier, on the night of August 7th, 1942, that ocean was empty. And Private First Class Robert Leckie crouched in his foxhole on Guadalcanal, listening to the jungle scream in the darkness, having no idea he was about to witness the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War. Nobody knew. Not the 19,000 Marines who'd just been abandoned by their own navy after 24 hours. Not the Japanese soldiers who'd fled into the jungle. Not the admirals who'd planned this operation in 6 frantic weeks. None of them understood that Guadalcanal was about to become a 6-month meat grinder, a place where more men would die at sea than on land, where both sides would pour everything they had into a tiny island smaller than Rhode Island, convinced that whoever controlled it would control the Pacific. They were right. In his foxhole that first night, Leckie heard footsteps in the darkness. Close. Maybe 10 feet away. Shoot and maybe kill your friend. Don't shoot and maybe die. This was Guadalcanal, where America would learn that winning wasn't about better weapons or more men. It was about making impossible choices in the dark and living with the consequences. This is the story of how that ocean floor got filled. June 7th, 1942. The Battle of Midway was over. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. With them went the core of Japan's naval striking power, the elite pilots who'd attacked Pearl Harbor, and the aura of invincibility that had carried Japanese forces across half the Pacific in 6 months. In Washington, there was cautious celebration. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, called it the most crucial naval battle of the war. The newspapers proclaimed it a turning point. America had finally stopped the Japanese advance. But in the War Department, in the cramped planning rooms where men moved pins across maps of the Pacific, there was a more sobering realization. Midway had won a battle at sea. It hadn't won back a single inch of captured territory. The Philippines were still under Japanese control. 60,000 American and Filipino POWs dying in camps, survivors of the Bataan Death March. Malaya was still occupied. Singapore, the British Empire's Gibraltar of the East, was still flying the rising sun flag. Burma had fallen. The Dutch East Indies had fallen. Wake Island, Guam, half of New Guinea, all gone. An area larger than the continental United States, conquered in 6 months. And everywhere, the pattern had been the same. Japanese forces attacked with fanatical courage and superior jungle warfare tactics. Allied forces retreated, surrendered, or died. At Bataan, 12,000 American soldiers surrendered and were marched to death. At Singapore, 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, the largest capitulation in British military history. In Java, the Dutch colonial army collapsed in 8 days. In Burma, British forces retreated 900 miles through the jungle, losing half their men to disease and starvation before reaching India. The psychological impact was devastating. By June 1942, a dangerous mythology had taken root in both Japanese and Allied minds. Maybe the Japanese were simply better at jungle warfare. Maybe their soldiers, raised in a warrior culture, trained to view surrender as the ultimate disgrace, willing to die for the emperor, were inherently superior to Western troops. Japanese military doctrine reinforced this belief. The Senjin-kun, the military code issued to every Japanese soldier, stated it explicitly: do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a name soiled by disgrace. This wasn't rhetoric. At Midway, Japanese pilots whose planes were too damaged to return had deliberately crashed them into American ships. At Wake Island, the Japanese garrison had fought until literally every defender was dead or wounded. Surrender was not in their vocabulary. American soldiers, by contrast, had been taught that surrender was acceptable if the situation became hopeless. Geneva Convention. Rules of war. Honorable surrender when further resistance was futile. At Bataan, 78,000 men had surrendered and discovered too late that the Japanese didn't recognize those rules. So the question haunting Allied planners in June 1942 was brutally simple. Could American forces, raised in a culture that valued individual life, that allowed honorable surrender, that had never fought a jungle campaign, actually defeat Japanese soldiers on the ground? Nobody knew, because it had never happened. Midway had been fought entirely at sea and in the air. Carrier planes against carrier planes. Ships against ships. Not a single American infantryman had set foot on Japanese-held territory and lived to tell about it. That was about to change. The strategic situation in the Pacific, after Midway, presented three possible directions for an American counteroffensive. Each had advocates. Each had risks. And the choice would determine not just the next battle, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Option 1. The North. In the Aleutian Islands, the chain of volcanic rocks stretching from Alaska toward Japan, the Japanese had occupied Attu and Kiska during the Midway operation. It was the only piece of American territory under Japanese control. Some voices argued for immediate recapture, a matter of national pride and territorial integrity. But the strategic value was minimal. The Aleutians were frozen, fog-bound rocks where you couldn't build meaningful air bases and from which you couldn't threaten Japan. The Japanese garrison was tiny and isolated. They were more of an embarrassment than a threat. Option 2. The Center. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, looked at the vast expanse of the Central Pacific, the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the Marianas, and saw a direct path to Japan. Island hopping across the Pacific. Each island providing air bases for the next jump. A naval-dominated campaign that would bypass Japanese strongpoints and strike directly at the home islands. It was elegant. It was bold. It was exactly the kind of decisive naval strategy that Admiral King loved. But it had a fatal flaw. The Imperial Japanese Navy, though bloodied at Midway, was still powerful. They still had 6 aircraft carriers operational. They still had battleships that outgunned anything in the American fleet. And they had interior lines of communication. They could respond to an American thrust faster than America could advance. More importantly, Hawaii was still vulnerable. If American carriers pushed into the Central Pacific and were destroyed, there would be nothing between Japan and the Hawaiian Islands. Nothing between Japan and the West Coast. Admiral Nimitz, cautious and calculating, wasn't ready to take that risk. Option 3. the South, which left the South Pacific, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the back door to Japan through Australia. This was where the immediate threat lay. Japanese forces were advancing down the Solomon Islands chain and across New Guinea, pushing toward Port Moresby, the last Allied stronghold in the region. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be cut off. The Japanese could establish air bases within bomber range of Sydney and Melbourne. They could strangle the sea lanes. Australia, with its vast resources, its strategic ports, its potential as a staging base for American forces, would be neutralized. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area, had been screaming about this threat since he'd escaped from the Philippines in March. Flamboyant, egotistical, and politically connected, MacArthur had promised, "I shall return to the Philippines." But he couldn't return if Japan controlled the entire South Pacific. The decision, when it came, was almost inevitable. The South Pacific offered the most pressing threat and the clearest opportunity. Japanese supply lines there were stretched thin. The Imperial Japanese Navy, weakened at Midway and the Coral Sea, couldn't dominate those waters the way they could the Central Pacific. And Australian bases provided staging areas for American forces. There was just one problem. Nobody could agree on who should command the offensive. The fight over who would control the South Pacific offensive nearly derailed the entire operation before it started. It became a bitter contest between the United States Army and the United States Navy, two services that, in 1942, barely spoke to each other and certainly didn't trust each other. General Douglas MacArthur believed the offensive should be his. He was Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area. The Solomon Islands fell within his area of responsibility. He had army divisions, he had air forces, and he had the strategic vision for how to roll back Japanese conquests and eventually return to the Philippines. On June 8, 1942, MacArthur presented his plan to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Operation Tulsa, a full-scale assault on Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the South Pacific, located on the island of New Britain. Rabaul was the key to everything. Japanese bombers flying from Rabaul's 5 airfields controlled the entire Solomon Islands chain. Japanese ships based at Rabaul's magnificent natural harbour dominated the sea lanes. If you controlled Rabaul, you controlled the South Pacific. MacArthur's plan was characteristically bold. Land the 1st Marine Division directly on New Britain, supported by 3 aircraft carriers, and take Rabaul in 14 days. 14 days. In Washington, General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, loved it. Bold. Decisive. The kind of operation that could change the entire war in one stroke. Admiral Ernest King read the proposal and nearly had an apoplexy. King was tall, lean, and intimidating. His own daughter said he was the most even-tempered man in the Navy. He's always in a rage. He'd spent 40 years in the Navy and had no patience for what he considered Army incompetence. And MacArthur's plan, in King's view, was monumentally incompetent. The problem wasn't Rabaul itself. King agreed it needed to be taken. The problem was trying to take it in one giant leap. Rabaul was surrounded by Japanese air bases. Hundreds of aircraft within striking distance. The 3 American carriers MacArthur wanted would be sailing into a hornet's nest, and carriers, as Midway had just proven, were devastatingly vulnerable to air attack. Lose those 3 carriers, and America might lose the entire Pacific. King's counterproposal was more cautious, but also more realistic. Instead of jumping straight to Rabaul, advance up the Solomon Islands one step at a time. Capture Tulagi first, a small island with a seaplane base. Then take the rest of the southern Solomons. Then Bougainville. Then, finally, Rabaul. Eliminate the Japanese air bases as you went. Each island you captured became a base for attacking the next. Slow, methodical, less risky for the precious carriers. MacArthur hated it. Cautious is less than #0. 5# is greater than defensive-minded. Typical Navy thinking. He fired off cables to Washington, arguing that King's plan would take years and waste thousands of lives. But MacArthur's real objection was simpler. King's plan called for the offensive to be commanded by the Navy, specifically by Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, commander of the South Pacific area. The rationale was straightforward. This would be primarily an amphibious and naval operation. Marines would do the landing. Navy ships would provide support and supply. Navy aircraft from carriers would provide air cover. Therefore, the Navy should command it. MacArthur saw it differently. This was a transparent Navy power grab, an attempt to sideline the Army and claim credit for the Pacific War. He accused Admiral King of trying to reduce the Army to a training and supply organization while the Navy won all the glory. The fight grew so bitter that by late June, the entire offensive was in jeopardy. MacArthur refused to provide any Army support for a Navy-commanded operation. King refused to risk carriers on MacArthur's reckless plan. And while they argued, the Japanese were fortifying their positions. Finally, General Marshall intervened. On June 30th, Marshall flew to Washington to meet personally with Admiral King. The two men, Army and Navy, representing services that had been rivals for decades, hammered out a compromise. The operation would be divided into 3 phases. Phase 1, assault on Tulagi and the southern Solomon Islands. Commanded by Admiral Gormley and the South Pacific area, using primarily Marine forces. Phase 2, seizure of Lae, Salamaua and the rest of the Solomon Islands. Commanded by General MacArthur and the Southwest Pacific area, using primarily Army forces. Phase 3, final assault on Rabaul, also commanded by MacArthur. It was elegant in its simplicity. The Navy would get the first, most risky phase, establishing the initial beachhead. The Army would get the subsequent phases, and the final glory of taking Rabaul. Both services would play crucial roles. Neither could claim the other was irrelevant. On July 2nd, 1942, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued the directive. Operation Watchtower was born. The target, Tulagi and a nearby island called Guadalcanal, where intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were building an airfield. The timeline, 6 weeks to plan and execute the first amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. 6 weeks. Military historians would later call it insane. A properly planned amphibious invasion required 6 months of preparation, detailed intelligence, rehearsals, specialized equipment, careful coordination between land, sea, and air forces. Operation Watchtower would have 6 weeks. The Marines who would have to execute it had a simpler name for the operation. They called it Operation Shoestring. While American admirals and generals fought over command, the Japanese were busy turning Guadalcanal from a strategic backwater into a potential dagger pointed at Australia's throat. The island had never been important before. Guadalcanal was 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, a fever-soaked jungle island in the southern Solomon chain. The interior was mountainous and covered in rainforest so dense that aerial photographs showed nothing but green canopy. The coasts were fringed with coconut plantations, a few tiny villages, and malarial swamps. Temperature averaged 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with 90% humidity. It rained almost every afternoon, torrential downpours that turned dirt into mud and streams into raging torrents within minutes. The island was home to saltwater crocodiles, poisonous snakes, and insects that could transmit malaria, dengue fever, and half a dozen other tropical diseases. Even the native population was sparse. Maybe 10,000 Melanesian islanders living in scattered coastal villages, most of whom had minimal contact with the outside world. The only Westerners on the island were a handful of Australian coast watchers, intelligence operatives left behind when the Japanese conquered the region, living in the jungle with radios, reporting Japanese movements. In strategic terms, Guadalcanal was worthless. Until the Japanese realized it had one critical asset, flat ground near the coast where you could build an airfield. The strategic logic was simple. Japanese forces were pushing south through the Solomon Islands and across New Guinea toward Port Moresby, but they were operating at the extreme range of their air cover from Rabaul, over 500 miles away. Bombers could barely reach the combat zones and had no margin for fighting or evasion. Fighters couldn't reach them at all. An airfield on Guadalcanal would solve that problem. It would put Japanese bombers within range of the New Hebrides, Fiji, and Samoa, the entire Allied supply line to Australia. It would provide fighter cover for the next push toward Port Moresby. It would make the southern Solomons effectively invulnerable to Allied counterattack. In May 1942, a Japanese reconnaissance team landed on Guadalcanal and surveyed the north coast near the mouth of the Lunga River. Perfect. A narrow coastal plain, flat, relatively dry, with good approaches from the sea. Build a runway there and you'd control the South Pacific. On June 8th, the same day, MacArthur was proposing his Rabaul invasion. The first Japanese construction units landed on Guadalcanal. 1,350 men from Captain Monzen Kanai's 13th Construction Unit. 1,221 men from Lieutenant Commander Okamura Tokunaga's 11th Construction Unit, plus engineers, guards, and support personnel. About 3,000 men total, most of them Korean labourers brought from occupied Korea. They had orders to complete the airfield in 6 weeks. The work was brutal, clearing jungle in 90-degree heat and 90% humidity, holing coral to create a compacted surface, building drainage ditches to handle the afternoon rains, constructing revetments and fuel dumps. The men worked through malaria, through dysentery, through heat exhaustion. Several died from disease or accidents, but the work proceeded on schedule. By late July, they had cleared a runway 2,600 feet long, enough for fighters and light bombers. The Australian coast watchers hidden in the hills above reported every detail back to Allied intelligence. Location, dimensions, number of Japanese personnel, projected completion date. This intelligence reached Washington and transformed the entire strategic picture. A Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal wasn't just a threat to Port Moresby, it was a potential knockout blow to the entire Allied position in the South Pacific. It had to be captured or destroyed before it became operational. Admiral King added Guadalcanal to the target list for Operation Watchtower. Not just Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The Marines would have to take both. This news reached the man who would have to execute the operation with all the welcome of a death sentence. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift was 55 years old, a Marine Corps veteran of 33 years, and about to receive orders for an operation that violated every principle of amphibious warfare he'd learned in 3 decades of service. Vandegrift looked like a Marine general from central casting. Tall, erect bearing, iron grey hair, steady gaze. He spoke softly and rarely raised his voice, but when he gave an order, Marines moved. He'd served in the Caribbean interventions, in China, and in the peacetime corps. He'd risen through the ranks, not through political connections or flamboyant leadership, but through steady competence. The kind of officer who didn't make dramatic pronouncements, but who got things done. In early July 1942, Vandegrift commanded the 1st Marine Division. Or, rather, he commanded most of it. Because the division was scattered across the Pacific, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The 5th Marine Regiment was in Wellington, New Zealand. The 1st Marine Regiment was in San Francisco, loading onto transports. The 7th Marine Regiment was in Samoa. Division artillery was split between 3 different locations. Support units were still training in the United States. The division had never conducted a training exercise together, never practiced an amphibious landing. Many of the Marines were so new they'd barely finished boot camp. And now they were being ordered to conduct the most complex military operation in warfare, an opposed amphibious invasion, in 6 weeks. When Vandegrift received the orders on July 7th, his first reaction was disbelief. The timeline was impossible. The intelligence was inadequate. The air support was uncertain. The naval support was conditional. And his division was still scattered across half the Pacific Ocean. He immediately requested a delay. 3 months. Just give him 3 months to assemble his division, conduct proper training, gather adequate intelligence, and plan the operation correctly. The response from Admiral King was swift and inflexible. No. The Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would be operational by August 1st. Once it was operational, capturing it would be exponentially more difficult. You'd be landing under air attack from the field you were trying to capture. The operation would proceed on schedule. August 7th, 1942. 5 weeks away. Vandegrift had no choice but to make it work. The first problem was assembling his forces. The 5th Marines in Wellington would form the core of the invasion force. They'd been in New Zealand since June, theoretically training for amphibious operations. In reality, they'd spent most of their time unloading their transports, which had been loaded in the United States by civilian stevedores who'd crammed equipment into the holds with no thought to combat offloading. Everything had to be unloaded, sorted, and reloaded in tactical order. Ammunition and weapons first, then food and water, then everything else. This consumed weeks. The 1st Marines, loading in San Francisco, would sail directly to the invasion rendezvous, is less than #0. 5# is greater than. They'd join the operation without ever meeting the rest of the division. The 7th Marines in Samoa would remain there. Vandegrift couldn't have them. They'd form the division reserve, to be sent forward only if the initial landing succeeded. Vandegrift would invade Guadalcanal with 2/3 of his division, about 19,000 men. The second problem was intelligence. Nobody knew anything about Guadalcanal. The maps available were ancient British colonial surveys from the 1920s, crude, inaccurate, and showing only the coastal areas. The interior of the island was marked unexplored. Aerial photographs showed nothing but jungle canopy. You couldn't tell if the ground under that canopy was solid or swamp, level or mountainous. Nobody knew how many Japanese were on the island. Estimates ranged from 2,000 to 10,000. Nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew what kind of defenses they'd built. The most valuable intelligence came from the Australian coast watchers and from a few pre-war residents who'd lived on the island. They could describe the terrain near the airfield, identify possible landing beaches, warn about reefs and tides. But they couldn't tell Vandergrift what he most needed to know. Where were the Japanese, and how hard would they fight? The third problem was air support. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would command the carrier task force, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, with their combined air groups of about 250 aircraft. Fletcher was 56 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who'd won the Medal of Honor at Veracruz in 1914. He'd commanded carriers at the Coral Sea and at Midway. He knew what carriers could do. He also knew how vulnerable they were. The Coral Sea had cost him the carrier Lexington, torpedoed and burning, abandoned and scuttled. Midway had cost him the carrier Yorktown, bombed, torpedoed and sunk. Fletcher had seen too many carriers die, and now he was being asked to take his 3 carriers, virtually all American carrier strength in the Pacific, into range of Japanese air bases at Rabaul. At a planning conference aboard his flagship Saratoga, Fletcher made his position clear. His carriers would support the landing. They'd provide air cover while the Marines went ashore and while the transports unloaded. For 72 hours. After that, the carriers were leaving. With or without the Marines. With or without completing the unloading. 72 hours, and not 1 minute more. The stunned silence that greeted this announcement spoke volumes. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. The Marines would have 3 days to land, capture the airfield, unload all their supplies and equipment, and establish a defensive perimeter that could withstand counterattack. If they didn't finish in 72 hours, they'd be abandoned, stranded on a hostile island with whatever supplies they'd managed to get ashore, facing Japanese air attacks from Rabaul without any air cover, facing Japanese naval forces without any naval support. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who would command the amphibious force, protested vigorously. 72 hours was inadequate. It took longer than that just to unload the transports. You needed at least 5 days, preferably a week. Fletcher was unmoved. He had his orders from Admiral Nimitz, no unnecessary risks to the carriers. The carriers were more valuable than any island, more valuable than any marine division. If the carriers were lost, Japan could advance all the way to Australia, and there'd be nothing to stop them. 72 hours. Then he was pulling out. Vandergrift said nothing during this exchange. He understood Fletcher's logic. He even, privately, agreed with it. But understanding it didn't make it any less of a death sentence for his Marines. The invasion fleet sailed from Wellington, New Zealand on July 22, 1942. 82 ships, 3 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 14 cruisers, 31 destroyers, 23 transports and cargo ships carrying 19,000 Marines. It was the largest American amphibious operation since the Spanish-American War in 1898. Vandergrift stood on the bridge of his transport Macaulay and watched the fleet assemble. 82 ships stretching to the horizon. It looked like overwhelming force. But he knew the truth. Those 82 ships were all that stood between Japan and Australia. If this operation failed, if the Japanese sank enough of those ships, if the Marines couldn't take the airfield, if Fletcher pulled out too soon, there wouldn't be another chance. Japan would complete their conquest of the South Pacific. Australia would be isolated. And America would be pushed back to Hawaii, fighting a defensive war for years. Everything depended on the next few weeks. Everything depended on an island most Americans had never heard of. Everything depended on 19,000 Marines who were about to learn what it meant to fight the Japanese on the ground. July 26, 1942. Koro Island, Fiji. The invasion fleet had gathered at a remote anchorage, 82 ships crammed into a sheltered bay, preparing for the final rehearsal before the real thing. In theory, an amphibious landing rehearsal allowed commanders to identify problems, test communications, practice coordination between ships and shore parties. It was supposed to build confidence. The rehearsal at Koro Island did the opposite. It revealed that almost nothing worked. The first problem emerged immediately: the landing craft. The Marines were using Higgins boats, 36-foot plywood craft with a bow ramp that dropped down to let men charge onto the beach. They were new, untested, and the Navy coxswains piloting them had barely any training. At Koro, the boats headed toward the wrong beaches. Some circled in confusion, unable to find their designated landing zones. Others hit reefs that weren't marked on the charts and got stuck, forcing Marines to wade ashore in chest-deep water. Several boats broached in the surf and capsized, dumping men and equipment into the ocean. The second problem was timing. In an amphibious assault, waves of landing craft needed to hit the beach in precise sequence. First wave, infantry assault teams. Second wave, weapons and support. Third wave, ammunition and supplies. At Koro, the waves arrived in random order. Ammunition landed before the troops who needed it. Artillery pieces landed without their crews. One entire battalion landed on the wrong beach and spent 2 hours hiking to their actual objective. The third problem was communication. Radio sets got soaked during the landing and stopped working. Signal flags were invisible through the dust and smoke of the bombardment. Runners got lost trying to find unit commanders. For hours, Admiral Turner aboard his flagship had no idea what was happening on the beach. He couldn't tell if objectives were taken or if Marines were pinned down. He couldn't coordinate naval gunfire support because he didn't know where friendly forces were. The rehearsal was a catastrophe. That night, Vandergrift met with his regimental commanders aboard the Macaulay. The mood was grim. Colonel Leroy Hunt of the 5th Marines was blunt. "Sir, if this had been the real thing, we'd have lost half the division before we got off the beach." Vandergrift couldn't disagree. But there was no time for another rehearsal. No time to retrain the coxswains, or fix the radio sets, or drill the landing procedures until they worked. The invasion was scheduled for August 7th, 11 days away. The fleet needed 3 days just to reach Guadalcanal. That left 1 week to fix everything that had gone wrong at Koro. 1 week to turn a disaster into a functioning amphibious operation. Van der Grift spent that week moving between ships, meeting with battalion commanders, reviewing plans, trying to anticipate what would go wrong. The intelligence picture hadn't improved. Nobody knew how many Japanese were on Guadalcanal. The estimates ranged from 2,000 to 10,000, a 5-fold uncertainty that made planning almost impossible. The latest aerial photographs showed the airfield was nearly complete. 2,600 feet of runway, fuel dumps, revetments for aircraft. The Japanese were days away from making it operational, which meant the invasion couldn't be delayed. Not even 24 hours. August 7th, or never. On July 31st, the fleet departed Kuro Island and set course northwest toward the Solomon Islands, toward Guadalcanal, toward the unknown. 19,000 Marines, most of whom had never seen combat, sailing toward an island they knew nothing about to fight an enemy who'd never lost. The men spent the 3-day voyage checking weapons, sharpening bayonets, writing letters home. Many of the letters said the same thing: "Don't worry, we'll be back by Christmas." They had no idea they were sailing towards 6 months of hell. August 7th, 1942. 0400 hours. The invasion fleet approached Guadalcanal in darkness, moving at 8 knots through calm seas. No lights showed on any ship. Radio silence was absolute. Aboard the transports, Marines were already awake. Impossible to sleep before your first combat. They ate breakfast in the pre-dawn darkness, steak and eggs, the traditional meal before an amphibious assault. Many couldn't eat. Stomachs were too tight with nervous energy. At 0500, the first hint of grey appeared on the eastern horizon. At 0513, the destroyer Blue, screening ahead of the main fleet, reported by signal lamp, enemy unaware. No activity visible. Kofa. They'd achieved complete surprise. The Japanese on Guadalcanal had no idea that 82 American warships were about to descend on them. At 0613, with dawn breaking across the Solomon Islands, the bombardment began. The sound was unlike anything the young Marines had heard before. The heavy cruiser, Quincy, opened fire, first, her 8-inch guns hurling shells toward the Japanese positions on Guadalcanal. Then Astoria. Then Vincennes. Within 2 minutes, every cruiser and destroyer in the bombardment group was firing. The noise was physical. Each salvo from the 8-inch guns created a pressure wave that hit you in the chest like a punch. The 5-inch guns from the destroyers added a higher-pitched crack. The combined effect was a continuous roar that made speech impossible and thought difficult. On Guadalcanal, the shells landed in the jungle around the airfield and along the beaches. Explosions erupted in towers of dirt and vegetation. Palm trees disintegrated. The airfield, so carefully constructed over the past month, disappeared in smoke and dust. At 0630, carrier aircraft from Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp joined the bombardment. Dauntless dive bombers screamed down from 8,000 feet, releasing their bombs at 1,500 feet. Wildcat fighters strafed the beaches with 50 caliber machine guns. The Japanese construction workers, most of them Korean laborers with no combat training, fled into the jungle in panic. They'd been told the Americans wouldn't attack for months. They weren't soldiers. They had no weapons, except a few rifles for the guards. They ran. At 0740, the first wave of landing craft left the transports and headed for the beaches. Private First Class Robert Leckie crouched in the Higgins boat with 40 other Marines from H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. The boat pitched and rolled in the mild swell. Sea spray came over the bow ramp. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and vomit. Around him, Marines gripped their rifles and stared at nothing. Some prayed silently. Some chain-smoked cigarettes. Some just breathed, in and out, trying to control the fear. The bombardment continued ahead of them. Shells whistled overhead. The beach, still 2 miles away, was invisible through the smoke. Nobody knew what they were about to face. At 0910, the first Higgins boat hit Red Beach on Guadalcanal. The bow ramp dropped. And the Marines charged into and nothing. No machine gun fire met them. No artillery. No snipers. The beach was empty. The Marines spread out in textbook assault formation, weapons ready, expecting the ambush to come at any second. But the jungle ahead remained silent, except for the rustling of wind in the palm trees. More boats landed. More Marines poured onto the beach. The beachmaster, the officer controlling the landing, kept waiting for Japanese resistance to materialize. It never did. By 0930, 3,000 Marines were ashore on Guadalcanal, advancing inland in combat formation against an enemy who wasn't there. The truth became clear over the next hour. The Japanese had abandoned the airfield. All 2,500 construction workers, all the guards, all the engineers, gone into the jungle. The Marines found their breakfast, still cooking on the stoves. Rice in pots, still warm. Tea in cups, still hot. The bombardment had caught them completely by surprise, and they'd fled without taking anything. By noon, the 5th Marines had occupied the airfield without firing a shot. It seemed too easy. Suspiciously easy. Van der Grift knew better than to celebrate. The Japanese hadn't been defeated, they'd retreated, and sooner or later they'd counterattack. The real battle for Guadalcanal hadn't started yet. While the landing on Guadalcanal unfolded like a training exercise, 20 miles to the north, Marines were learning what fighting the Japanese actually meant. Tulagi was a small island, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, but it held critical importance. The Japanese had built a seaplane base there, and Tulagi's harbour was one of the best natural anchorages in the Solomons. More importantly, Tulagi had a real garrison. Not construction workers. Not support personnel. Real Japanese combat troops, 350 men from the 3rd Kure Special Naval Landing Force, plus another 550 support personnel. The SNLF, Special Naval Landing Forces, were the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite infantry, roughly equivalent to the US Marine Corps, better trained than regular Japanese army units, better equipped, and indoctrinated with the Bushido Code that made surrender literally unthinkable. Commander Suzuki Masaki commanded the Tulagi garrison. When the American bombardment began at dawn, he knew immediately what it meant. This wasn't a raid. This was invasion. Suzuki gathered his officers and gave them their orders. Simple. Inflexible. Fight to the last man. Kill as many Americans as possible. No surrender. No retreat. Every man accepted this without question. They would all die today or tomorrow. The only question was how many Americans they could take with them. At 0800, Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion hit Beach Blue on Tulagi. The Raiders were a new concept, elite Marine units trained for small unit operations and amphibious raids. Edson himself was a legend in the Corps, a small, soft-spoken man with ice water in his veins and a reputation for taking on impossible missions. His Raiders landed without opposition. The beach was empty. The jungle ahead was silent. It looked exactly like Guadalcanal, suspiciously quiet. But Edson had fought in Nicaragua, hunting guerrillas through jungle terrain. He knew what a prepared defense looked like. He could feel it. The Japanese were waiting somewhere ahead, dug in, ready. He deployed his raiders in extended formation and moved inland cautiously. By 0900, they'd advanced about 1,000 yards without contact. The island's single road ran along the ridgeline ahead. The jungle on both sides was thick enough to hide anything. At 0915, Company B crossed an open area near a cricket pitch left over from British colonial days. The Japanese opened fire. Machine guns from 3 directions. Rifle fire from concealed positions. Light mortar fire that had been pre-registered on the open ground. The raiders hit the dirt. 3 men didn't make it, cut down in the initial burst. The rest took cover behind fallen logs, in shell craters, anywhere that offered protection from the interlocking fields of fire. This was what fighting the Japanese was actually like. Not the textbook battles they'd trained for. Not the scenarios where you could see the enemy and bring superior firepower to bear. The Japanese were invisible. Their positions were so well camouflaged that even when you were looking directly at them, you couldn't see them. They'd fire a burst, then shift position before you could return fire. Their machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, where every approach was covered by at least 2 guns. And they didn't panic. When American mortar rounds landed near their positions, they didn't run. They waited until the barrage lifted, then resumed firing. Company B was pinned down for an hour before Company A could maneuver around the left flank and suppress one of the machine gun positions with grenades. The raiders killed 6 Japanese soldiers in that first engagement. It cost them 8 wounded and 3 dead. And they'd advanced maybe 300 yards. This was going to take a while. By nightfall on August 7th, Edson's raiders had pushed the Japanese back to a ridge called Hill 208. Every 100 yards had been contested. Every Japanese position had to be taken by frontal assault after the defenders had inflicted maximum casualties. The Japanese never retreated until their position was overrun. They never surrendered. They fought until they were dead, or so badly wounded they couldn't fight anymore, and then they often pulled the pins on grenades as Marines approached, trying to take one more American with them. By nightfall, the raiders had suffered 26 casualties. The Japanese had lost perhaps 50 men. And the main Japanese defensive position was still ahead, Hill 281, a steep ridge at the southeastern end of the island, where Commander Suzuki had concentrated the bulk of his forces. Edson halted his advance as darkness fell. Night combat in the jungle was suicide. You couldn't tell friend from enemy. Friendly fire casualties would be higher than enemy casualties. The raiders dug in and waited for morning. What they got was something they hadn't trained for. At 10:30 p.m., the Japanese attacked. Not with artillery preparation, not with covering fire. Just suddenly, out of the darkness, screaming Japanese soldiers charging the Marine lines with bayonets fixed. It was chaos. Muzzle flashes in the darkness. Men shouting. The clash of bayonets. Hand-to-hand fighting in foxholes, where you couldn't tell who you were fighting until you were close enough to kill them. The Japanese weren't trying to break through. They were trying to die while killing as many Marines as possible. Suicide attacks. Banzai charges into machine gun fire. Men with grenades rushing foxholes, pulling the pins, holding the grenades until they exploded, killing themselves and anyone near them. The Marines held. Barely. When dawn broke on August 8th, the ground in front of the Marine lines was littered with Japanese bodies. 27 dead in front of one company's position alone. The Marines counted their own casualties. 11 dead. 29 wounded. They'd held their position. They'd stopped the Banzai charges. But every Marine who'd experienced that night attack now understood something that would haunt them for the rest of the campaign. The Japanese weren't going to quit. They weren't going to surrender. They were going to keep fighting until every single one of them was dead. This wasn't a war where you could accept surrender and move on. This was a war of annihilation. Either you killed every Japanese soldier, or they killed you. There was no middle ground. On August 8th, Edson's raiders resumed their attack on Hill 281. They advanced behind a barrage from the cruiser, San Juan, 8-inch shells, slamming into the ridge, blasting trees into splinters, churning the earth. When the barrage lifted, the raiders charged up the slope. The Japanese, the ones who'd survived the bombardment, opened fire from concealed positions. Machine guns, rifles, light mortars. The raiders took casualties climbing the steep slope, but they kept coming. They reached the Japanese positions and cleared them with grenades and bayonets. By noon, the American flag was flying on Hill 281. But the Japanese still controlled a ravine on the eastern side of the hill, a steep-sided gully choked with vegetation where the bombardment hadn't reached. Commander Suzuki and the last of his men, maybe 50 survivors out of the original 350, were dug in there. The raiders couldn't use naval gunfire in the ravine, too close to friendly positions. Artillery was ineffective. The shells just buried themselves in the soft earth before exploding. They'd have to go in and dig the Japanese out. It took until nightfall. Marines would advance a few yards, throw grenades into a cave or dugout, shoot anyone who survived the grenades, then advance a few more yards to the next position. Yard by yard, body by body. By dark, on August 8th, the ravine was cleared. 57 Japanese bodies lay in the ravine and on the slopes of Hill 281. No prisoners. No surrenders. Every Japanese soldier had died fighting. Commander Suzuki's body was found near the top of Hill 281, still holding his sword, dead from a dozen bullet wounds. Tulagi was secured. The raiders counted their casualties. 38 dead, 55 wounded. Against a Japanese force, less than a quarter their size, fighting in prepared positions. If this was what the Japanese could do with 350 men, what would they do with 3,000? With 30,000? The Marines on Tulagi had just learned what the rest of the 1st Marine Division was about to discover over the next 6 months. The Japanese would never quit, never surrender, never retreat unless ordered. Every island, every hill, every bunker, every foxhole would have to be taken by force. And the Japanese would make you pay in blood for every yard. If Tulagi was difficult, the twin islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo were worse. Gavutu was tiny, barely 500 yards long, and dominated by Hill 148, a coral ridge honeycombed with caves. Tanambogo was even smaller, connected to Gavutu by a narrow causeway at low tide. Together, they held about 550 Japanese, most of them from the Yokohama Air Group, support personnel for the seaplane base. Not elite SNLF troops like on Tulagi, not even regular infantry. Just sailors, mechanics, radio operators, support troops who'd never expected to fight. But they had 2 advantages. First, the terrain. Gavutu and Tanambogo were solid coral rock. You couldn't dig foxholes. You had to build up with sandbags. But the Japanese had caves. Natural caves in the coral, reinforced with concrete, impossible to destroy with naval gunfire. Second, they'd seen what happened at Tulagi. They knew the Americans were coming. And they'd decided, like Commander Suzuki, that they would all die fighting. The 1st Parachute Battalion was tasked with taking Gavutu. The Parachute Battalion was another elite unit, Marines trained for airborne operations, though they'd never made a combat jump. On Gavutu, they'd make an amphibious landing instead. At 1200 hours on August 7th, they hit the beach. The landing was a nightmare. The Higgins boats approached a short pier on the northern side of Gavutu, the only possible landing site. The Japanese knew this. They'd sighted machine guns to cover the pier from 3 directions. The first boat reached the pier. The bow ramp dropped. Marines charged out. Japanese machine gun fire swept the pier. Men fell. Some into the water, some onto the pier. The survivors pressed forward. There was no cover on the pier. Your only chance was to reach the island and find something to hide behind. More boats landed. More Marines charged the pier. More men fell. And the Japanese on Tanambogo, 300 yards away across the water, could fire at the Marines on Gavutu. Enfilade fire, hitting the Marines from the side while they were focused on the front. Within 20 minutes, the Parachute Battalion had lost 30 men, killed or wounded, 10% of their strength, just getting off the beach. The survivors pushed inland toward Hill 148. The Japanese retreated into their caves and fought from there. Marines couldn't see them, couldn't suppress them with rifle fire. The caves were immune to everything except a direct hit by naval gunfire, and the cruisers offshore couldn't risk hitting the Marines, who were now mixed in with the Japanese positions. The Marines had to clear each cave individually, throw grenades in, rush the entrance before the Japanese could recover, shoot anyone inside, move to the next cave. It was butcher's work. Close range. Brutal. Terrifying. By nightfall, on August 7th, the Parachute Battalion controlled most of Gavutu but hadn't cleared all the caves. Japanese snipers and machine gun teams were still firing from concealed positions. The Marines had lost 44 men killed and 70 wounded, nearly 20% casualties. And they still had to take Tanambogo. The first attempt to take Tanambogo was a disaster. At dusk on August 7th, a company of the 2nd Marines, 150 men, loaded into Higgins boats for a landing on Tanambogo's eastern shore. The plan was simple: land at dusk, use the fading light for concealment, rush the Japanese positions before they could organize a defense. What could go wrong? Everything. The boats approached the shore in the gathering darkness. So far, so good. The Japanese didn't seem to have spotted them. Then a shell from the destroyer transport Neville hit a fuel dump on Tanambogo. The dump exploded in a fireball that lit up the entire island like daylight. The Marines were exposed, silhouetted against the flames, in boats that offered no protection. The Japanese, 240 men, mostly air group personnel, but now desperate and fighting for their lives, opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns, rifles, even a 3-inch gun, all aimed at boats full of Marines who couldn't fire back effectively and couldn't take cover. The company commander was killed in the first burst. His executive officer was killed seconds later. The boat's coxswains, seeing their passengers getting slaughtered, reversed engines and pulled away from the island. The company withdrew to Gavutu, having accomplished nothing except losing 14 men killed and wounded. Tanambogo would have to wait until morning. August 8th dawned with Gavutu mostly secure, but Tanambogo still in Japanese hands. This time, the Marines weren't taking chances. At 0800, the cruiser San Juan began a methodical bombardment of Tanambogo. 8-inch shells, each one weighing 260 pounds, slammed into the tiny island at a rate of 4 per minute. The bombardment lasted an hour. By the time it stopped, Tanambogo looked like the surface of the moon, cratered, smoking, every building destroyed, every tree shattered. At 0900, 2 companies of the 2nd Marines landed and discovered that Japanese defenders in caves and coral fortifications could survive even that kind of bombardment. The fighting on Tanambogo was the worst of the entire operation. Hand-to-hand combat in the ruins. Marines and Japanese grappling with bayonets and knives. Grenades thrown into caves, followed by rifle fire into the smoke, followed by Marines charging in with fixed bayonets to finish anyone who survived. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew they were going to die and wanted to take as many Americans with them as possible. By noon, the Marines had secured 2/3 of Tanambogo. The remaining Japanese, maybe 50 men, were trapped on the western end of the island with their backs to the sea. They didn't surrender. They didn't try to swim to safety. They kept fighting until dark, when the last Japanese soldier was killed in his foxhole. Tanambogo was secured on August 9th. The cost: 61 Marines killed, 82 wounded, to take an island 500 yards long. The Japanese lost all 240 men. Not a single prisoner. Not a single survivor. By August 9th, the initial landings were complete. Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo secured. Guadalcanal's airfield captured without a fight. The Southern Solomons were in American hands. The 1st Marine Division had suffered relatively light casualties, considering the scale of the operation. 108 killed, 140 wounded. It looked like a victory. But the Marines who'd fought on Tulagi and Tanambogo knew better. They'd learned what the rest of the division was about to discover. The Japanese didn't surrender. didn't retreat unless ordered, fought from prepared positions with suicidal courage. If 350 Japanese could hold up a Marine battalion for 2 days on Tulagi, what would happen when the Japanese sent real reinforcements? When they sent thousands of troops instead of hundreds? The Marines had taken the Southern Solomons. Now they had to hold them. And the Japanese were already preparing their counterstrike. August 8th, 1942, 2300 hours. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner sat in his cabin aboard the transport Macaulay, reviewing the day's progress with Major General Vandergrift and British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley. The meeting should have been a celebration. The landings had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The airfield on Guadalcanal was captured intact. Tulagi was secured. American forces were firmly established in the Southern Solomons. Instead, the mood was grim, because Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had just sent a message that changed everything. The carriers were leaving, not in 3 days as promised. Tomorrow morning. Fletcher's reasoning was sound from a naval perspective. Japanese air attacks from Rabaul had been hitting the fleet all day, not heavily, but enough to prove the carriers were vulnerable. The carrier Wasp was low on fuel. Fighter aircraft losses meant reduced defensive capability. Better to withdraw now, while the carriers were intact, than risk losing them trying to protect the transports. Turner had no choice but to agree. Without carrier air cover, his transports and cargo ships would be sitting ducks for Japanese bombers. He'd have to withdraw too, which meant the Marines would be left on Guadalcanal with less than half their supplies unloaded. No heavy equipment. No construction machinery to finish the airfield. Limited ammunition. Limited food. No way to bring in reinforcements or resupply. Vandergrift took the news without visible emotion, but his stomach tightened. His Marines were about to be abandoned. The meeting broke up around midnight. Crutchley returned to his flagship, the cruiser Australia. Vandergrift returned to his command post ashore. Turner remained aboard Macaulay, planning the withdrawal for dawn. None of them knew that a Japanese striking force was already approaching. And none of them knew that in 6 hours the United States Navy would suffer one of the worst defeats in its history. Vice Admiral Mikawa Gunichi had been planning this attack since the moment he learned of the American landings. Mikawa commanded the 8th Fleet, based at Rabaul. He was 54 years old, a veteran of 36 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he understood exactly what the American landing meant. If the Americans established themselves on Guadalcanal, they'd have an airfield within fighter range of Rabaul. They could intercept Japanese bombers. They could attack Japanese shipping. They could cut the supply line to the entire Solomon Islands. The American landing had to be crushed immediately before they could consolidate. But Mikawa didn't have much to work with. His carriers were too far away to reach Guadalcanal in time. His battleships were dispersed across the Pacific. His air forces had been hammering the American fleet all day with minimal results. What he did have was cruisers. 5 heavy cruisers: Chokai, Alba, Kako, Kinugasa, Furutaka. 2 light cruisers, Tenryu and Yubari. 1 destroyer, Unagi. 8 warships against an American fleet of 82 ships, including 3 aircraft carriers and a battleship. The odds were suicidal. Unless Mikawa could achieve complete surprise and attack at night when Japanese superiority in night combat could offset American numbers. On August 7th, at 1940 hours, Mikawa's striking force departed Rabaul and set course southeast toward Guadalcanal. They sailed down the channel between the Solomon Islands, a passage that would later be known as the Slot, at high speed, planning to arrive off Guadalcanal around midnight on August 8th. Mikawa's plan was audacious. His force would pass south of Savo Island, enter the sound between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, attack the American transports with torpedoes and gunfire, then withdraw north of Savo before dawn. Hit fast. Hit hard. Sink as many transports as possible. Escape before American carrier aircraft could retaliate at dawn. It required perfect timing and perfect navigation. It required avoiding detection during the approach. It required defeating whatever American warships were guarding the transports. Mikawa believed his cruisers could do it. Japanese cruisers carried the Type 93 torpedo, 24 inches in diameter, powered by oxygen instead of compressed air, with a range of 40,000 yards at 48 knots. American sailors would call them Long Lance torpedoes and would learn to fear them. Japanese cruiser crews trained constantly for night combat. Their optics were superior to American equipment. Their tactics emphasized speed and aggression. And Japanese naval doctrine accepted casualties as the price of victory. If Mikawa lost half his force but destroyed the American transports, it would be worth it. The Americans, by contrast, were exhausted. The warships screening the transports, 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers under Admiral Crutchley, had been at battle stations for 48 hours. Crews were running on coffee and adrenaline. Radar operators stared at green screens until their eyes blurred. Lookouts peered into darkness until they started seeing things that weren't there. Crutchley had divided his screening force into 3 groups. The southern group, 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers, guarded the passage south of Savo Island. Crutchley himself commanded this group from his flagship Australia. The northern group, 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers, guarded the passage north of Savo Island. Captain Frederick Reefcoll commanded from the cruiser Vincennes. The eastern group, 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, guarded the eastern approaches. Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded from the cruiser San Juan. And 2 destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot, patrolled west of Savo Island, serving as picket ships to give warning of approaching enemy forces. On paper, it looked like a solid defense. In reality, it had fatal flaws. First, the groups weren't positioned to support each other. If one group was attacked, the others would need 30 minutes to reach them. 30 minutes in which the attacked group would be fighting alone. Second, when Crutchley left his flagship to attend Turner's midnight meeting, he didn't tell the other group commanders he was going. He didn't transfer tactical command to anyone else. He just left. Which meant that when the Japanese attacked, there was no overall commander coordinating the defense. Third, the radar. The American cruisers carried 2 types of radar. The newer SG radar could detect surface ships at ranges up to 15 miles with reasonable accuracy. The older SC radar was designed for detecting aircraft and was nearly useless for surface search. Only 2 ships, the cruisers Chicago and San Juan, had the new SG radar. The rest had SC radar or no radar at all. And nobody had trained the crews on how to interpret radar contacts during a surface action. The technology was too new. The doctrine didn't exist. Most cruiser captains still relied on visual sighting, lookouts with binoculars, searching the darkness for the silhouette of enemy ships. Against a Japanese force trained specifically for night combat, using optical equipment superior to anything the Americans had, this was a recipe for disaster. At 2300 hours, on August 8th, Mikawa's striking force was 50 miles northwest of Savo Island, approaching at 26 knots. Mikawa launched 4 float planes from his cruisers, 1 to scout ahead, 3 to provide illumination during the attack. The planes flew low over the water, engines throttled back, hoping to avoid detection. At 0107 on August 9th, the destroyer Blue, patrolling west of Savo Island, detected the Japanese striking force on radar. Range 9 miles. Bearing northwest. The Blue's commanding officer, Commander Harold Williams, studied the radar contact. It could be enemy ships, or it could be the island of Savo. Radar couldn't always distinguish between land and ships. Or it could be rain squalls. Williams decided it was probably Savo Island and didn't report the contact. 5 minutes later, lookouts on the Japanese cruiser Chokai spotted the Blue, a dark shape against the slightly less dark ocean, 4 miles away. Mikawa ordered his force to reduce speed to 12 knots and maintain absolute silence. No radio, no engine noise, no lights. The Japanese cruisers glided past the Blue like ghosts. The Blue never saw them. At 0138, Mikawa's lookouts spotted the American Southern Group, 3 cruisers silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky to the south. Range 8 miles. Mikawa ordered his force to increase speed to 30 knots and prepare for immediate attack. The Japanese cruisers launched their torpedoes at 0143. 45 Long Lance torpedoes hissed into the water, fanning out toward the American ships, running silent at 48 knots. The Americans still hadn't seen them. At 0147, the Japanese float planes dropped flares. Brilliant white light illuminated the sound between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, casting stark shadows, turning night into day. And there, perfectly silhouetted by the flares, were the American cruisers. Canberra, Chicago, 2 destroyers. Cruising slowly in a rectangular patrol pattern, completely unaware that 8 Japanese warships were about to open fire at point-blank range. The Japanese opened fire. The cruiser Chokai's first salvo hit Canberra amidships. The shell's 8-inch armour-piercing rounds punched through the Australian cruiser's thin armour and exploded inside. More salvos followed. Furutaka, Euba, Kako. Within 4 minutes, Canberra had been hit 24 times. Her engine rooms were flooded. Her boilers were destroyed. Fires raged amidships and forward. She was dead in the water, listing to starboard, powerless. Captain Frank Getting, Canberra's commanding officer, lay dying on the bridge, his legs shattered by shell fragments. His executive officer was dead. Half the bridge crew was dead or wounded. Canberra would sink before dawn, taking 84 men with her. The cruiser Chicago was luckier. She took 1 torpedo hit forward, which blew off her bow but didn't penetrate the vital spaces, and several shell hits that caused fires but didn't cripple her. Her captain, Howard Bode, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of pursuing the Japanese or warning the other American groups, Bode turned west and retreated at high speed. He later claimed he was chasing Japanese destroyers. The official report was more diplomatic, but every officer who studied the action reached the same conclusion. Captain Bode ran away. And he didn't warn anyone. The northern group, Vincennes, Astoria, Quincy, and 2 destroyers, had no idea they were about to be attacked. They were cruising slowly north of Savo Island, maintaining a rectangular patrol pattern when Japanese shells started falling around them at 0150. Captain Reefcoll on Vincennes thought at first it was American ships firing at aircraft. Then he thought it might be shore batteries on Savo Island, even though Savo Island had no shore batteries. It took him 3 minutes to realize he was under attack. By then, it was too late. The Japanese striking force had divided into 2 columns, one attacking from the east, one from the west, catching the American cruisers in a crossfire. Vincennes took hits from both columns. 8-inch shells smashed her bridge, her gun directors, her fire control systems. She returned fire blindly, hitting nothing. Captain Reefcoll tried to maneuver, tried to get his ship out of the killing zone. But Vincennes was on fire, taking hits every few seconds, losing steering control, losing power. At 0216, a torpedo from the cruiser Kinugasa hit Vincennes below the waterline. She began to list. The fires spread. The list increased. At 0230, Reefcoll gave the order to abandon ship. Vincennes capsized and sank at 0300 hours, taking 332 men with her. The cruiser Astoria fought bravely but hopelessly. She was on fire from the first salvo, her bridge wrecked, her captain wounded. But her gun crews kept fighting, firing at muzzle flashes in the darkness, scoring hits on the Japanese cruiser Chokai. It wasn't enough. Astoria took 65 hits. Her superstructure was a mass of twisted metal and raging fires. Her main guns were knocked out. Her engineering spaces were flooding. She stayed afloat until noon on August 9th, her crew fighting the fires for 12 hours, before finally sinking. 216 men died with her. The cruiser, Quincy, died fighting. She took a salvo that killed her captain and most of the bridge crew within seconds of the first Japanese attack. Her executive officer took command and tried to ram the nearest Japanese cruiser, a desperate, suicidal attempt to do something, anything, to hurt the enemy. Quincy never got close. Japanese shells and torpedoes tore her apart. She was hit so many times, nobody could count them all. She burned. She listed. She broke apart. At 0238, Quincy rolled over and sank. 389 men died with her. The entire battle lasted 32 minutes. By 0220, it was over. 4 American heavy cruisers, Canberra, Vincennes, Astoria, Quincy, were sinking or sunk. 1 more, Chicago, was damaged and fleeing. 2 destroyers were damaged. American casualties, 1,077 dead, 709 wounded. Japanese casualties, 58 dead, 53 wounded. 1 cruiser, Chokai, moderately damaged. It was one of the worst defeats in US Navy history. And Admiral Mikawa, incredibly, withdrew without attacking the transports. His reasons were sound. He'd lost track of American carrier positions. Dawn was approaching. If American carrier aircraft caught his force in daylight, his cruisers would be destroyed. Better to withdraw with a victory, 4 American cruisers sunk, than to gamble on destroying the transports and lose his entire force. At 02:20, Mikawa ordered his striking force to withdraw north of Savo Island and set course for Rabaul. The Japanese cruisers vanished into the darkness as suddenly as they'd appeared. Dawn broke over Savo Island on August 9th to reveal the full scope of the disaster. 4 cruisers gone, over 1,000 American sailors dead. The surface screening force shattered. Admiral Turner had no choice. Without cruisers to protect his transports, he couldn't remain in the area. Japanese bombers from Rabaul would destroy his undefended transports one by one. At 06:18, Turner gave the order. The transports would withdraw immediately, even though less than half the supplies had been unloaded, even though the Marines still needed ammunition, food, construction equipment, medical supplies. The Navy was leaving. On Guadalcanal, the Marines watched the transports disappear over the horizon. 19,000 men stranded on a hostile island with half their supplies, no air cover, no naval support, and no way to get reinforcements. Facing a Japanese empire that had just proven it could destroy American naval forces at will. Private Robert Leckie stood on the beach and watched the last ships vanish. Around him, Marines stood in small groups, silent, realizing what had just happened. They'd been abandoned. A sergeant next to Leckie spat into the sand. "Well, boys," he said quietly, "I guess we're on our own now." Nobody argued. August 9th, 1942. Morning. Major General Vandergrift stood at his newly established command post near the captured airfield and took stock of the situation. It was bad. The Navy had left him with approximately half the supplies he'd requested. Some of it was still sitting on the beaches where it had been hastily dumped. Some of it was scattered through the jungle where Marines had dragged it, trying to find cover during Japanese air raids. Some of it was simply missing, either never unloaded or unloaded in the wrong place. Food was the immediate concern. The Marines had 14 days of rations, 2 weeks. After that, they'd be eating captured Japanese rice, assuming the Japanese didn't come back and recapture it first. Ammunition was worse. Artillery had enough shells for maybe 3 days of sustained firing. Machine guns had enough belted ammunition for 1 major engagement. Rifle ammunition was adequate, but not plentiful. No reserves. No way to resupply. Once they fired what they had, there wouldn't be more. Heavy equipment was almost non-existent. The Japanese had left behind some construction equipment, bulldozers, graders, trucks, but most of it was damaged or out of fuel. The Marines had captured fuel dumps, but they didn't know if the fuel would work in Japanese engines or American engines. Medical supplies were dangerously low. The field hospital had plasma, morphine, and bandages for maybe 200 casualties. After that, doctors would be improvising. And then there was the airfield. The Japanese had built a runway 2,600 feet long, barely adequate for fighters, too short for bombers. More critically, they hadn't finished it. The surface was compacted coral, but it needed grading, drainage, and maintenance facilities. Without construction equipment and aviation gasoline, the airfield was useless. And without the airfield operational, the Marines had no air cover except occasional raids by long-range aircraft from Espiritu Santo, 500 miles away, too far for effective support. Vandergrift called his staff together and laid out the priorities. First, establish a defensive perimeter around the airfield. Dig in. Prepare for counterattack. Second, complete the airfield. Get it operational. Bring in fighters and bombers to provide air cover. Third, survive until reinforcements arrived. Nobody asked when reinforcements would arrive. Nobody knew. Maybe weeks. Maybe months. Maybe never. The Marines got to work. The defensive perimeter took shape over the next 3 days. It was shaped like a horseshoe following the coastline from the mouth of the Tanaru River, actually Alligator Creek, but the Marines called it the Tanaru because of a map error, west along the beach to Kukum village, then south into the jungle. The perimeter was 7 miles long, far too long for 19,000 men to defend adequately. Military doctrine said you needed 1 battalion, about 800 men per mile of front. Vandergrift had 2 battalions per mile, which sounds like enough until you realize that men need sleep, need to eat, need to rotate off the line. The actual number of men on the line at any given time was maybe half the total force, which meant the perimeter was stretched dangerously thin. The Marines dug foxholes, 2-man positions deep enough to provide cover from artillery, spaced about 30 yards apart along the perimeter. They strung barbed wire. Not much, there wasn't much wire available, but enough to slow down an attack and channel attackers into killing zones. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, set up mortars with pre-registered targets, sighted artillery to cover the most likely avenues of approach. And they waited. Because everyone knew the Japanese were coming. The only questions were when and how many. The Japanese air raid started on August 9th and continued daily for the next 6 weeks. Every day, around noon, so regularly the Marines called it Tojo time and set their watches by it, Japanese bombers would appear. Usually 18 to 24 bombers, twin-engine Bettys flying in tight formation at 20,000 feet, escorted by 15 to 20 Zero fighters. The Marines had no fighters to intercept them, no anti-aircraft guns heavy enough to reach them. All they could do was take cover and watch the bombs fall. The bombing was surprisingly ineffective. Bombing from 20,000 feet against dispersed targets in the jungle was like throwing darts at a map. Most bombs landed in empty jungle. Occasionally, they'd hit a supply dump or a command post. Casualties were usually light, 2 or 3 men killed, a dozen wounded. But the psychological impact was severe. The Marines couldn't fight back, couldn't shoot down the bombers, couldn't even hide effectively. The jungle wasn't dense enough to provide real cover. All they could do was huddle in foxholes and hope the bombs didn't land on them. Day after day, for weeks. The constant stress, knowing that every day at noon, bombs would fall and you might die, and there was nothing you could do about it, wore men down faster than combat. At night, the Japanese Navy added to the harassment. Japanese destroyers and submarines would approach Guadalcanal in darkness and shell the Marine positions. Not heavy bombardment, destroyers didn't carry large caliber guns, just enough to keep the Marines awake, to make sure nobody got a full night's sleep. Shells would whistle in from the darkness, explode randomly across the perimeter. Kill a man here, wound 2 men there, destroy a supply dump, set fires. Then the destroyers would vanish before dawn, before American aircraft could retaliate. The combination of daily bombing and nightly shelling had a cumulative effect. Men slept in shifts, 2 hours at a time. They were constantly tired, constantly on edge, constantly waiting for the next attack. And then there was the jungle itself. Guadalcanal was beautiful in a hostile, alien way. Towering trees with canopies that blocked the sun. Undergrowth so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Vines hanging from every branch. The smell of rotting vegetation, thick and cloying. Temperature was 90 degrees every day, 90% humidity. Your uniform was soaked with sweat within an hour of dawn. It never dried. Your skin stayed wet 24 hours a day. Rain fell every afternoon. Not gentle rain, torrential downpours that turned the ground into mud, flooded foxholes, made rifles misfire, rotted boots and uniforms. The insects were worse than the Japanese. Mosquitoes so thick they formed clouds. Every man got bitten dozens of times per day. Malaria was inevitable, not if you'd get it, but when. There were other insects too. Ants that bit like fire. Flies that laid eggs in open wounds. Leeches in the streams that attached to your skin and had to be burned off with cigarettes. Centipedes 8 inches long that delivered agonizing stings. Spiders the size of dinner plates. Scorpions that hid in boots and clothing. And at night, the jungle was alive with sounds. Birds, insects, animals moving through the undergrowth, all of it sounding like Japanese soldiers infiltrating the lines. Marines would fire at shadows, at sounds, at movements that turned out to be falling branches or foraging pigs. And sometimes the sounds really were Japanese soldiers. You never knew. Within 2 weeks, the Marines were calling Guadalcanal the Island of Death. Not because of combat. Combat they understood. Combat you could train for, prepare for, fight through. The Island of Death killed you slowly, with heat and disease and exhaustion and constant fear, with malaria and dysentery and dengue fever, with infected wounds that wouldn't heal in the tropical humidity, with fungus that rotted your feet inside your boots. The Marines lost more men to disease than to Japanese action in the first month. And morale began to crack. The tipping point came on August 12th. Colonel Frank Gutsch, the division intelligence officer, had been interrogating captured Korean laborers. One of them reported that there were Japanese soldiers west of the Matanikau River who wanted to surrender. This seemed incredible. Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. Everyone knew that. But Gutsch wanted to believe it. If Japanese soldiers were willing to surrender, it meant they were demoralized, beaten, ready to give up. It meant the campaign might be shorter than expected. He organized a patrol, 25 men, to make contact with these Japanese soldiers and accept their surrender. It was a trap. The patrol landed by boat at the mouth of the Matanikau River on the night of August 12th. As they moved inland, Japanese machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. The patrol was pinned on the beach with no cover. Colonel Goetsch was killed in the first burst. The sergeant who tried to take command was killed seconds later. The Japanese didn't want prisoners. They wanted to kill every American they could reach. The patrol fought until they ran out of ammunition. Then the Japanese moved in with bayonets and swords. Of the 25 men on the patrol, only 3 escaped. One of them, Platoon Sergeant Frank Few, swam 4 miles through shark-infested waters back to American lines. 22 men dead in a single night. The division intelligence officer dead. All because someone believed Japanese soldiers might surrender. The lesson was clear. The Japanese would never surrender, never give up, never stop fighting until they were dead. And they'd use deception, ambush, any tactic that worked. This wasn't a war where you could accept surrender and move on. This was a war where trusting the enemy got you killed. The massacre of the Goet Patrol changed the Marines' attitude. Before, some belief that Japanese soldiers were human beings who might surrender under the right circumstances. After, the Japanese were the enemy. Period. You killed them before they killed you. No mercy. No quarter. No second chances. It was going to be that kind of war. August 19th, 1942. Night. The Marines on Guadalcanal had learned to hate the darkness. Darkness brought Japanese infiltrators. Darkness brought shelling from destroyers offshore. Darkness brought sounds in the jungle that might be animals or might be men crawling toward your foxhole with a grenade. But on the night of August 19th, darkness brought something new. 6 Japanese destroyers running south down the slot at 30 knots, carrying 900 soldiers of the Ichiki detachment. The Americans would call these high-speed destroyer runs the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called them rat transportation. Either way, they changed everything. Because the Japanese had figured out how to reinforce Guadalcanal, destroyers were fast enough to make the run from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back in one night. Fast enough to avoid American air attack. Fast enough to arrive after dark and leave before dawn. A destroyer couldn't carry much cargo, maybe 150 men or 30 tons of supplies. But 6 destroyers could land 900 men in a single night. Run the Express every few nights, and you could build up a substantial force. The Americans couldn't stop it. They had no warships in the area. The Navy had withdrawn after Savo Island. They had no aircraft that could operate at night. They had no way to even detect the Tokyo Express until it was too late. So the Japanese reinforced, night after night, building their strength, preparing for the counterattack that everyone knew was coming. Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao commanded the first major reinforcement. He was 43 years old, a veteran of 20 years in the Imperial Japanese Army, and he was absolutely certain he would recapture Guadalcanal within 3 days. His confidence wasn't baseless. The Ichiki detachment was elite infantry, battle-hardened troops who'd fought in China and Manchuria. They'd originally been earmarked for the invasion of Midway. When Midway was cancelled, they'd been diverted to Guadalcanal instead. They were tough, well-trained, disciplined, and they'd been told the Americans on Guadalcanal numbered maybe 2,000 men, demoralized, low on supplies, ready to be swept off the island by a determined attack. This was victory disease at its worst. The Japanese High Command, accustomed to 6 months of uninterrupted victories, couldn't imagine that a small American force could hold out against elite Japanese troops. So they underestimated American strength, underestimated American resolve, and sent too few men with too little support. Ichiki's 900 men landed at Taivu Point, 20 miles east of the marine perimeter, on the night of August 19th. They marched west immediately, moving through the jungle in disciplined formation, confident they were about to destroy an inferior enemy. On August 21st, at noon, a marine patrol under Captain Charles Brush encountered Ichiki's advance guard near the village of Koli. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. Brush's Marines killed 34 Japanese soldiers at a cost of 3 American dead. More importantly, they captured documents from the dead Japanese officers, maps, operation orders, intelligence indicating a force of unknown size approaching from the east. Vandegrift immediately reinforced the eastern end of the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines dug in along the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, misnamed the Tenaru River on American maps. The creek wasn't much, maybe 30 yards wide, waist deep with a sandbar at the mouth where it emptied into the ocean. But it was a natural defensive position. The Japanese would have to cross the sandbar, completely exposed, or wade through the creek under fire. Pollock positioned his men on the west bank, machine guns covering the sandbar, mortars registered on the likely approaches, barbed wire strung across the obvious crossing points. And they waited. Ichiki attacked at 02:30 on August 21st. No reconnaissance, no artillery preparation, no attempt at stealth or maneuver. Just a straight frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese soldiers charged out of the jungle, bayonets fixed, screaming, "Banzai!" believing their spirit and courage would overwhelm American firepower. The Marines opened fire. Machine guns raked the sandbar at point-blank range. Rifles fired as fast as men could pull triggers. Mortars dropped shells into the packed Japanese formations. The slaughter was horrific. Japanese soldiers fell in waves. The sandbar became carpeted with bodies. Some men made it to the barbed wire and died there, caught on the wire, shot repeatedly as they tried to tear it down. A few, maybe 20, made it through the wire and engaged the Marines in hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets, knives, rifle butts. The Marines drove them back. Ichiki tried again, and again, and again. 5 separate charges across that sandbar. 5 times the Marines cut them down. By dawn, the attacking force was shattered. The sandbar was piled with Japanese bodies. The water of Alligator Creek ran red. And Vandegrift sprang his trap. At 0700 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines crossed Alligator Creek inland, out of sight of the Japanese, and swung north to hit Ichiki's survivors from behind. Cresswell's battalion had 5 light tanks. The first tanks deployed on Guadalcanal. The Japanese had no anti-tank weapons, no anti-tank training. They'd never fought tanks before. The tanks rolled forward, machine guns firing, crushing foxholes, running over Japanese soldiers who tried to fight them with rifles and bayonets. It was a massacre. The Japanese were trapped between Cresswell's battalion advancing from the south and Pollock's battalion holding the sandbar to the west. Tanks on one side, machine guns on the other. The ocean to the north. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. By 1600 hours, it was over. 877 Japanese soldiers dead, 15 captured, most of them wounded and unconscious. 128 escaped into the jungle and made it back to Taivu Point. American casualties: 44 dead, 71 wounded. Colonel Ichiki, seeing his command destroyed, committed ritual suicide. He burned his regimental colours, shot himself, and had an aide finish him with a sword. The Battle of the Tanaru was the first time American ground forces had defeated a Japanese attack in the Pacific War. Not just held them off, not just retreated in good order, actually destroyed them. The myth of Japanese invincibility on land was dead. But for the Japanese High Command, the lesson was different. They'd sent too few men, underestimated American strength. The solution wasn't to give up on Guadalcanal. It was to send more troops. Many more troops. August 24th, 1942. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku was planning his next move. The disaster at Midway had cost him 4 carriers and the core of his naval air power, but he still had resources, still had carriers, still had battleships, and he was determined to turn Guadalcanal into the decisive battle that would destroy American naval power in the Pacific. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Admiral Tanaka would run a convoy of fast transports down the slot, carrying 1,500 troops to reinforce Guadalcanal. This would force the American carriers to intervene. They couldn't allow Japanese reinforcements to reach Guadalcanal unmolested. And when the American carriers appeared, Yamamoto would destroy them. He had 3 carrier groups at sea: the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, the light carrier Zuiho, plus the light carrier Ryujo as a sacrificial decoy. Total: 177 aircraft. Against them, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's carriers Enterprise and Saratoga, plus the carrier Wasp. Total: 254 aircraft. On paper, the Americans had the advantage. More carriers, more aircraft. But Yamamoto had better intelligence, better coordination, and a plan. The battle began at 01:45 on August 24th, when a PBY Catalina flying boat spotted Tanaka's convoy 200 miles north of Guadalcanal. Fletcher launched a strike at 1400 hours, 38 aircraft from Saratoga. They found nothing. Tanaka had reversed course when he learned he'd been spotted. The strike returned to Saratoga at dusk, low on fuel, having accomplished nothing. But the Japanese had found the Americans. At 1600 hours, a Japanese floatplane spotted Fletcher's carriers and radioed their position to Yamamoto. Yamamoto ordered his carriers to launch a full strike. But it was too late in the day. By the time the aircraft could reach the Americans, it would be dark. Night carrier operations were suicidal. The strike was delayed until morning. Both sides spent the night maneuvering, trying to position themselves for the first strike at dawn. Dawn broke on August 24th, with both carrier groups searching for each other at ranges of 200 to 300 miles. The Japanese launched first. At 0600 hours, the light carrier Ryujo, the sacrificial decoy, launched 15 aircraft toward Guadalcanal. The mission was to attack Henderson Field. The real mission was to draw American attention while the main carrier force prepared its strike. It worked. At 12:30, an American scout plane spotted Ryujo. Fletcher immediately launched a full strike from Saratoga, 38 aircraft. While Saratoga's planes flew north toward Ryujo, Japanese scouts found Fletcher's carriers. At 1350, the Japanese main strike launched from Shokaku and Zuikaku. 64 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters. The two strike groups passed each other in the air, each heading for the other's carriers. Saratoga's strike found Ryujo at 1600 hours. The little carrier tried to evade, turning hard, launching more aircraft, throwing up anti-aircraft fire. It wasn't enough. The American dive bombers scored 3 direct hits. The torpedo bombers added 1 torpedo. Ryujo burned, listed, and sank 2 hours later. Mission accomplished for the decoy. She'd drawn the American strike away from the main Japanese carriers. Now, the Japanese strike was about to hit Enterprise and Saratoga without opposition. At 1645, radar on Enterprise detected the incoming Japanese strike. Range, 45 miles. Bearing, northwest. Altitude, 12,000 feet. Fletcher launched every fighter he had. 53 Wildcats. But the Japanese were approaching at high altitude, above where the Wildcats were positioned. And the American fighter direction was confused, sending fighters to wrong positions, failing to concentrate them for an effective intercept. Only a few Wildcats managed to engage the Japanese before they reached the carriers. At 1647, the Japanese split into 2 groups. One attacked Enterprise. One went after Saratoga. But Saratoga was hidden by a rain squall. The Japanese couldn't find her. So both groups attacked Enterprise. The carrier turned hard, trying to present the smallest possible target. Her anti-aircraft guns opened fire, 5-inch guns, 40mm guns, 20mm guns, everything she had. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells. The Japanese dive bombers came in from different angles, north, south, east, preventing Enterprise from evading all of them. The first bomb missed by 20 yards. Near miss. Shrapnel peppered the carrier's side. The second bomb hit the flight deck aft, penetrated to the third deck before exploding. Killed 35 men instantly. The third bomb hit near the centerline, blew a 10-foot hole in the flight deck, started fires below. The fourth bomb was a near miss that exploded underwater, damaging the hull. Enterprise shuddered from the impacts but kept moving. Damage control parties rushed to contain the fires. Medical teams worked on the wounded. The Japanese torpedo bombers came in low, skimming the water at 200 feet, launching their torpedoes at Enterprise and the battleship North Carolina. Anti-aircraft fire was intense. Wildcats dove on the torpedo bombers from above. 5 Japanese planes splashed into the ocean. But none of the torpedoes hit. Enterprise maneuvered violently, dodging the deadly tracks. North Carolina used her superior speed to outrun them. By 1700 hours, the Japanese strike was over. They'd hit Enterprise 3 times. Killed 74 men. Wounded 95. Caused significant damage to the flight deck and internal compartments. But Enterprise was still operational. Still launching and recovering aircraft. Still capable of fighting. American damage control was proving superior to Japanese striking power. The Japanese lost 25 aircraft in the attack. The Americans lost 7 Wildcats. The battle continued into the afternoon with smaller strikes and counterstrikes, but neither side could land a knockout blow. By nightfall on August 24th, both sides withdrew. Fletcher turned south, getting Enterprise out of range for repairs. Yamamoto turned north, his carriers low on aircraft and fuel. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons was technically an American victory. One Japanese carrier sunk, 75 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Tanaka's convoy forced to turn back. But the strategic situation hadn't changed. The Japanese still controlled the waters around Guadalcanal at night. They could still run the Tokyo Express. They could still reinforce. And they would. 2 days later, Tanaka tried again, this time using destroyers instead of slow transports. The Tokyo Express was back in business. September 1942 became known as Black September. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, it was a month of constant attacks, daily air raids, nightly shelling, and 2 major ground offensives that nearly broke the American perimeter. For the Navy, it was worse. On September 15, the submarine I-19 achieved what may have been the most successful submarine attack in history. Commander Kinashi Takaichi was patrolling southeast of Guadalcanal when he spotted an American carrier task force. 3 carriers, numerous escorts, a target-rich environment. At 14:45, Kinashi fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Wasp. 3 hit. The first torpedo struck forward, rupturing aviation gasoline storage tanks. The second hit amidships, near the bomb magazines. The third hit aft, near more gasoline storage. Within seconds, Wasp was engulfed in flames. Gasoline fires are almost impossible to extinguish on a ship. The gasoline vaporizes, the vapors ignite, and the fire spreads faster than damage control parties can contain it. Wasp's captain fought the fires for an hour, but the fires reached the bomb magazines. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. At 1600 hours, he gave the order to abandon ship. Wasp sank at 2100 hours, taking 193 men with her. But Kinashi's torpedoes did more damage than just sinking one carrier. The 6 torpedoes spread out in a fan pattern. 3 hit Wasp. 1 hit the destroyer O'Brien. 1 hit the battleship North Carolina. 1 missed. O'Brien survived the initial hit, but her hull was fatally weakened. She sank a month later while steaming to Pearl Harbor for repairs. North Carolina took a torpedo below the waterline that flooded several compartments and caused a 5-degree list. She survived, but needed 3 months of repairs. 1 submarine, 6 torpedoes. 1 carrier sunk. 1 destroyer sunk. 1 battleship damaged. It was the single most successful submarine attack of World War II. And it left Admiral Halsey, who'd replaced the exhausted Gormley as South Pacific commander, with only 1 operational carrier, Hornet. 1 carrier to contest the entire South Pacific against the Japanese fleet. The Japanese were winning the naval war. They controlled the waters around Guadalcanal at night. They could reinforce freely. They were sinking American carriers faster than America could replace them. And in October, they would try to finish what they'd started. October would bring the largest Japanese offensive yet. And it would bring one more carrier battle, the battle that would determine whether Japan or America controlled the Pacific. everything was building toward a climax. And the Island of Death was about to live up to its name. December 1942. Guadalcanal. The Island of Death had earned its name. But not from combat, from hunger. Japanese soldiers who'd landed on Guadalcanal as elite infantry, proud, disciplined, ready to die for the emperor, were now reduced to something barely recognizable as human. They wandered through the jungle eating grass, tree bark, roots, anything that might provide a few calories. Their hair had stopped growing. Their nails had stopped growing. Their beards had stopped growing. The body, starving, had shut down everything except the most essential functions. Dysentery was universal. Constant diarrhea that left men too weak to walk more than a few yards without resting. Malaria attacked men whose immune systems had nothing left to fight with. Dengue fever. Tropical ulcers that wouldn't heal. Of the 31,000 Japanese soldiers who'd landed on Guadalcanal over the past 5 months, only about 14,000 were still alive. And of those 14,000, maybe 3,000 were capable of fighting. The rest were walking corpses, waiting to die. The Tokyo Express had tried to supply them. Destroyers running down the slot every few nights, throwing barrels of rice overboard, hoping the soldiers could recover them from the beaches. But American aircraft strafed the barrels as they floated ashore. American PT boats torpedoed the destroyers. Out of every 10 barrels thrown overboard, maybe one reached Japanese hands. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. In Tokyo, in the offices of Imperial General Headquarters, the argument had been raging for weeks. Continue the Guadalcanal offensive? Pour more troops into the meat grinder? Or withdraw and establish a new defensive line farther north, is less than Hashon. 5 hash is greater than. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already made its decision. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had concluded after the naval battles of October and November that Guadalcanal was lost. The Americans controlled the waters around the island during the day. They had an operational airfield. They could bring in reinforcements faster than Japan could. More importantly, the naval losses were unsustainable. 2 battleships sunk. 4 cruisers sunk. 11 destroyers sunk. And the irreplaceable loss of carrier aircraft and pilots, the elite aviators who couldn't be replaced in less than 2 years. Every ship, every plane, every pilot lost at Guadalcanal was a ship, plane, or pilot that couldn't defend against the inevitable American advance. The Navy wanted out. The Army disagreed violently. Lieutenant General Hyakutake Harukichi, commander of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, argued that one more offensive could still succeed. One more push, with fresh troops. One more attempt to recapture Henderson Field. The Army's pride was at stake. Japanese ground forces had never retreated from an enemy, never abandoned territory they'd fought for, never admitted defeat. To withdraw from Guadalcanal would be to admit that Japanese soldiers couldn't defeat American soldiers, that the myth of Japanese superiority was just that, a myth. Better to die fighting than to retreat in disgrace. But General Imamura Hitoshi, commander of the newly formed 8th Area Army, responsible for both the Solomons and New Guinea, was a realist. He'd studied the numbers, the logistics, the casualty rates. To mount another offensive would require transporting at least 15,000 fresh troops to Guadalcanal. That would require 800 destroyer runs, impossible, or 20 seaplane tender runs, suicidal, or a large convoy, which would be destroyed by American aircraft before it reached the island. There was no way to build up enough force for a successful offensive. And even if there was, the troops on Guadalcanal were too weak to fight effectively. You couldn't mount an offensive with men who couldn't walk 100 yards without collapsing. On December 25, 1942, Christmas Day, Imamura submitted his recommendation to Imperial General Headquarters. Withdraw from Guadalcanal immediately. Establish a new defensive line in the Central Solomons. Save what was left of the 17th Army before it was completely destroyed. To everyone's surprise, Imperial General Headquarters agreed. On December 31st, the order was issued. Operation KE. The evacuation of Guadalcanal. The planning was meticulous. The evacuation would be conducted in 3 runs using destroyers, the only ships fast enough to make the trip in darkness. 20 destroyers per run. Each destroyer could carry about 250 men if they packed them like sardines. First run, early February. Evacuate the 38th Division and support troops. Target, 5,000 men. Second run, mid-February. Evacuate the 2nd Division and headquarters staff. Target, 4,000 men. Third run, late February. Evacuate the rearguard, the Kawaguchi and Ichiki survivors, the naval troops, anyone left behind. Target, 2,000 men. Expected casualties, 50% of the destroyers, 50% of the troops. That was the best-case scenario. Admiral Yamamoto privately believed they'd be lucky to save 5,000 men total. But General Imamura made a promise. "I will not abandon these men," he said. "We will save as many as we can, whatever the cost." It was the most audacious withdrawal operation in military history. Evacuating 10,000 men from under the noses of 50,000 American troops, with complete American air superiority, with American naval forces prowling the waters. It was impossible, which is why it might just work. January 1943. The Japanese needed the Americans to believe reinforcements were coming, not evacuations going out. So they ran the Tokyo Express more frequently. Destroyers charging down the slot every few nights, throwing supply barrels overboard, making a show of reinforcing the garrison. They increased air raids on Henderson Field. Bombers from Rabaul hitting the airfield daily, suggesting they were softening it up for a major offensive. They even planned a diversionary operation, a raid on Canton Island, hundreds of miles away, to draw American attention. And they moved fresh troops into the northern Solomons, where American reconnaissance would spot them and report a build-up. All of it designed to make the Americans believe one thing: the Japanese were preparing for another offensive. It worked. American intelligence, reading Japanese radio traffic, analyzing ship movements, interpreting aerial reconnaissance, concluded that Japan was planning a major push to retake Guadalcanal. Possibly the largest offensive yet. Maybe 20,000 fresh troops, supported by the combined fleet. Major General Alexander Patch, who'd replaced Vandergrift as commander on Guadalcanal, prepared for a defensive battle. He reinforced his lines. stockpiled ammunition, positioned artillery to cover likely Japanese approaches, called for naval support to intercept the expected Japanese convoy. Admiral Halsey sent every available ship to the South Pacific. Task forces positioned to intercept Japanese reinforcement convoys. Submarines deployed along likely approach routes. The Americans were ready for an invasion. They had no idea they were watching an evacuation. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese 17th Army began its withdrawal toward Cape Esperance, the northwestern tip of the island. It was a nightmare march. 15 miles through jungle terrain for men who could barely walk, carrying the wounded who couldn't walk at all. Moving at night to avoid American patrols is less than #0. 5# is greater than hiding during the day. Men died on the march, collapsed from exhaustion and never got up, succumbed to malaria or dysentery, simply gave up and waited for death. The rearguard, Major Yano Keiji's battalion, fought a brilliant delaying action, making the Americans believe they were facing a determined defense, not a retreat. Yano's men would ambush American patrols, inflict casualties, then withdraw to the next position. Hold a ridgeline for a day, make the Americans bring up artillery and air support, then abandon it during the night. Every delay gave more men time to reach Cape Esperance. Every casualty they inflicted convinced the Americans they were facing a strong defensive line, not an evacuation. By early February, approximately 10,000 Japanese soldiers had concentrated at Cape Esperance. They were ordered to wait offshore in small boats. Don't gather on the beaches where American aircraft could strafe them. Wait in the darkness on the water. And pray that the destroyers would come. February 1st, 1943, 2200 hours. Rear Admiral Hashimoto Shintaro led 20 destroyers down the slot at 30 knots. American aircraft had attacked them during the day. PT boats would attack them at night. But Hashimoto had been running the Tokyo Express for months. He knew every trick. His destroyers arrived off Cape Esperance at 2300 hours. And there, waiting in the darkness, were hundreds of small boats, rowboats, rafts, anything that could float, packed with skeletal figures who barely looked human. The destroyers launched their own boats and started hauling men aboard. Men too weak to climb the rope ladders had to be pulled up. Men who could barely stand were packed into every available space on deck. The smell was horrific. Months of jungle living without bathing. Infected wounds. Dysentery. Death. But the destroyer crews worked without complaint. These were their countrymen. Their brothers. By 0 to 100 hours, they'd loaded 4,935 men. More than expected. More than they'd hoped. Hashimoto ordered his destroyers to withdraw at maximum speed. One destroyer, Makigumo, hit a mine and had to be scuttled. But the rest escaped safely, reaching Bougainville by noon. The first run was a success. The second run came on February 4th. Again, 20 destroyers. Again, racing down the slot under cover of darkness. American aircraft attacked during the approach, damaging one destroyer that had to turn back. But the rest reached Cape Esperance. This time, the evacuation went even faster. The troops had learned from the first run. They were organized, ready, waiting in their boats. By midnight, 3,921 men were aboard, including Lieutenant General Hyakutake and Major General Maruyama, the senior commanders who'd led the failed October offensives. The destroyers withdrew without loss. 2 runs, 8,856 men evacuated, against all expectations. Admiral Yamamoto, who'd predicted they'd lose half the destroyers and save only 5,000 men, was stunned. Maybe they really could save them all. The 3rd run came on February 7th. 18 destroyers this time. 2 had been too damaged in previous runs to participate. The mission: evacuate everyone left. The rear guard. The wounded. Anyone who could make it to Cape Esperance. By now, the Americans were beginning to suspect something was wrong. Japanese resistance was collapsing too quickly. Positions that should have been defended to the last man were being abandoned without a fight. The Tokyo Express was running more frequently, but bringing fewer supplies. Maybe, just maybe, the Japanese were evacuating. But even if they suspected, it was too late to stop it. The 3rd run proceeded exactly like the first 2. Destroyers arrived at Cape Esperance. Boats came out of the darkness. Men were hauled aboard. This time, 1,796 men. The destroyers waited an extra 90 minutes, searching the darkness for any stragglers, making absolutely sure no one was left behind. Then they withdrew. By dawn, they were safely back at Bougainville. Operation KE was complete. Total evacuated 10,652 men, out of an estimated 14,000 still alive on the island. Far better than anyone had dared hope. The Japanese had pulled off one of the great evacuation operations in military history. They'd extracted an army from under the noses of an enemy with complete air and naval superiority. They'd done it in 3 runs without losing a single troop transport. They'd saved more men than anyone thought possible. But it didn't change the fundamental fact. Guadalcanal was lost. The island of death belonged to America. February 9th, 1943. 0600 hours. American patrols moved cautiously into the area around Cape Esperance. They expected resistance. Expected Japanese soldiers dug into caves and bunkers, fighting to the last man as they always did. Instead, they found silence. The Japanese positions were empty, abandoned, littered with equipment too heavy to carry, artillery pieces with barrels spiked, machine guns with firing pins removed, mortars smashed beyond repair. And bodies. Hundreds of bodies. Men too sick to evacuate. Men too weak to make the march to Cape Esperance. Men who'd simply given up and waited to die. The Americans who found them were shocked. These weren't the fierce Japanese soldiers they'd been fighting for 6 months. These were skeletons, with skin stretched tight over bones. Men who'd weighed 160 pounds in August now weighed 90. Starvation. Disease. Neglect. The island of death had killed them as surely as bullets would have. By noon on February 9th, patrols had reached Cape Esperance and found it deserted. The Japanese were gone. At 16:25, Major General Patch sent a message to Admiral Halsey. Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal effected 16:25 today. The Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal. It was over. 6 months, from August 7th, 1942 to February 9th, 1943. 186 days of hell. The Americans had lost 1,698 men killed on land, 4,890 sailors killed at sea, 420 airmen killed in the air. Total, 7,008 dead. The Japanese had lost 24,400 men on land, most from starvation and disease, 3,543 sailors at sea, at least 898 airmen in the air. Total, approximately 30,000 dead. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines. They lost hundreds of irreplaceable carrier aircraft and pilots. They lost the initiative in the Pacific War. After Guadalcanal, Japan would never mount another offensive. They would spend the rest of the war retreating, island by island, back toward the home islands. Guadalcanal was the hinge. Before Guadalcanal, Japan advanced. After Guadalcanal, America advanced. It was the battle that changed everything. Admiral Yamamoto understood this. In his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, he studied the casualty reports and the strategic assessments. He'd warned his government before Pearl Harbor that he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, Japan would lose. He'd been exactly right. 6 months after Pearl Harbor came Midway. 6 months after Midway came Guadalcanal. The window had closed. Japan had lost its chance to win the war. Everything from now on would be delay, fighting retreat, trying to make the Americans pay such a high price for every island that they'd negotiate a peace instead of demanding unconditional surrender. Yamamoto knew it wouldn't work. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity and American resolve. But he'd do his duty. Fight as long as he could. Hope for a miracle that wouldn't come. 4 months later, American fighters would ambush his aircraft over Bougainville and kill him. But on that February day in 1943, he sat in his cabin and contemplated the map of the Pacific. Guadalcanal, that tiny island in the Solomons, had changed the entire war. The island of death had killed not just 30,000 men. It had killed Japan's chance of victory.